Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, I always associate war and the battlefield with injury. For some strange reason, I hadn't really focused on the medicine and the support aspect. I just knew there was a one-way path.
There is, and all the way through history, you actually find medicine is actually closely associated, and probably one of the most early advanced medicine is of surgical medicine and of treating trauma. And that's because, unfortunately, humans have forever fought. And even Hippocrates has a quote that war is the only proper school for surgeons.
Wow.
And so this is where, unfortunately, doctors and medicine came to the forefront because this is where it was urgently needed and lives were at risk.
I wonder if this is why medical school is so combative.
It could be. You never know. Maybe it's innate. And look, the nature of war is as part of the human experience. You go through anything with history and you will find it scattered throughout. There's even some historians that said that war is good. It actually charges a society as to surviving. I think that's probably more a modern interpretation because for thousands of years, the human experience of war has actually been very similar. It's not until the modern era that things have changed. And I'll use some examples of that. But
Please do.
When we've got you have hand-to-hand combat for the most part, thousands of years. So this is using swords and daggers, and there's projectiles as well, arrows. When things got moving along, when the horse came along, or armies were able to move, had a lot more mobility. But for the most part, it was a venture that was lots of marching for the army. There was almost no injuries during that happening, as you would talk about war. But on the day of the battle, which was normally just a day, you were in incredible danger of injury and dying. But after the battle, if you hadn't been too injured, you were relatively safe. And so when we look at the ancient Egyptians, the Romans and the Greeks, their medicine in this area was mainly to do with wound healing, with torn flesh, injured muscles, broken bones. The complications they had were blood loss, and over time it tended to be infection, if it was. But what was important was bone setting and actually making sure that the injuries that were survivable, they did survive. Now, that's a challenging task, but you can see with the Egyptian writings and the Greeks and the Romans, they were experts at it, and that's because they did a lot of it. When you're talking about conquering societies, this is what they did. And so if we look into history, and it seems almost counterintuitive that the longest battle before modern times was in Napoleon's time. The longest battle was called the Battle of Leipzig, and it lasted 3 to 4 days. Wow. And so the injuries in that time would have been horrific. But in our modern time, when we're talking about years, there's such a different perspective on medicine, an emphasis on medicine. And so these people before modern times, they were experts at managing blood loss. So they would use ropes and belts to actually tie off a bleeding limb. They would use something that came into effect, which seems unimaginable at the moment, is wound cauterization. They would use boiling oil. So if someone was actually had either a limb cut off or they were excessively bleeding, they would use boiling oil to cauterize the wound to stop the bleeding.
See, I can just smell that now.
Well, with all the other smells going around on the battlefield.
true.
And so this, when we look at that statement of war accelerating society, that's a modern, probably, perspective. And the reason why it's a modern perspective is you can actually start to see it through war. Like, one of the first advancements that impacts today was Napoleon and his ability to move around the field. Well, actually, there was Napoleon's chief surgeon, Dominique Larrey, noticed this ability for artillery. They were called the flying artillery. And so they had horse-drawn carriage with the artillery on it, and they could actually move their artillery really quickly around the field. Now, this was seen as one of Napoleon's
advantages.
Exactly, around the field. And what happened was Dominic Larrey thought, well, I could use that as an ability to treat wounded soldiers. He created a corps called the Brigadiers, and these were pretty much dedicated stretch bearers, and their sole responsibility was to remove soldiers, injured soldiers, from the field. Now, that seems very logical to us, but clearly people were just dying on the field, and he thought, well, let's grab them, treat them, and maybe we'll be able to save them. And so it was called the flying ambulance. And so he got horse-drawn carriage, which was full with, well, as what we would, not exactly what we would think today, but it had medical equipment, it had staff, and it had a mattress in the back to transport these injured soldiers. And again, there is interesting perspective, as you see. It really is a sort of jolting to experience to us today, because you sit there and just go, they were just bringing people in and they were just treating them as they came in. But there was a quote from Charles Bell, who was a surgeon for the English at the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon in 1815, about this experience.
While I amputated one man's thigh, there lay at one time 13, all beseeching to be taken next. It was a strange thing to feel my clothes stiff with blood, and my arms powerless with the exertion of using the knife.
So this experience, again, is one of those things that Dominic Larrey looked at and said there has to be a better way. And so he was on the other side trying to work this out. He developed the triage system.
I thought you were going to say he developed ramping of ambulances at hospitals.
So the triage system was a system to prioritise patient against their needs at the time. So some people would have had life-threatening illnesses. If they are left, then they will die. Mm-hmm. But other people will probably be manageable, and so they can wait a little bit longer. And so that, whilst it seems perfectly reasonable and normal to us, was a revolutionary type approach to things. And what he came up with, and the reason he came up with it, is because there was so much trauma on a battlefield that you could always treat one person in normal society as they came in. Whereas today, lots of people, lots of either injuries or sickness, you have to have a priority.
Yes, of course.
So that takes us to, as we go to the American Civil War. And then we start to see this is where you get the modernization of weapons. And so this is considered the bloodiest conflict in US history. And the new technologies coming through, they had muskets to this point in time, but they were unpredictable. They sometimes would misfire, they wouldn't fire well. When the US Civil War came along, the weapon development had gotten very good, and they were able to shoot muskets that shot greater than 500 yards, and the injuries they caused were much more significant. And so they would often shatter bones, and so they had to actually work out, how do we manage this? And so there is what was considered the father of modern battlefield medicine. His name was Jonathan Letterman, and he was the medical director of the Army of Potomac, and he developed the ambulance corps. And so again, in similar kind of fashion to Dominic Larrey, and he had his own triage system where he had a 3-tiered system. And this was an assessment of their significance of injury and even whether they needed to be evacuated. And it was said that there was thousands of lives saved because of this system. Now, the interesting part about all of this coming together is how many people died in a war sometimes had nothing to do with the conflict.
Oh.
And so as you're starting to get cramped conditions, stressful conditions, and you're starting to get more artillery about, you're starting to get a lot more diseases coming through. And so this is things like dysentery, pneumonia, which was called camp lung for obvious reasons, typhus, and all these people are dying, nothing to do with the conflict. And so we then takes us to the Crimean War. Well, this is the story of
Florence Nightingale.
That's it.
Yes.
And so she came along and she went into a hospital near Constantinople. And when she arrived there, she had 38 volunteer nurses, and the soldiers who were in the hospital were in a terrible state. They were malnourished, they were dehydrated, had infected wounds. There was open latrines about. She worked hard for the next few years to improve conditions. The mortality rate in the hospital when she got there was about 41%. When she left, by the end of the war, it was 2%.
That is staggering.
And that is just common sense, what we would say common sense, but would have been revolutionary in being able to treat patients, to have systems of people who are infected not next to other people who are infected. And
this must be the difference of the same magnitude as the introduction of washing of hands, like for that incremental effect.
That's right. And you could see the impact, and that people, ancestors, will have been affected because and survived because of just simple measures off the field. And again, that's starting to understand the significance of the impact that the war can have. And so we come to an interesting comparison. So if we look at the 20th century and probably even Napoleon's time, when we look at the advancement in military weaponry, Napoleon, with his flying artillery, were using cannonballs that were the size of 3, 6, or 12 pounds, so about 5 kilograms for the field. If they had siege weapons, they were using 12 or 16 pounds, so about 7 or 8 kilograms to pretty much take down a castle or blow in a door. And these were shot by 6-inch howitzers, cannons, and that was what they used. That was considered revolutionary. When we get to World War I, you start to see just the sheer magnitude of change. And the heaviest shell in World War I was 1.4 tons. So it was
one shell.
Over 3,000 pounds, and it was shot by a 52 centimetre howitzer. And it went for the distance. The other ones were used either short range or on the battlefield itself. These distances could be shot 5 kilometres, extending up to 10 kilometres, and the longest range was 80 miles or 128.
In World War I.
In World War I. And so this, you're just seeing the sheer magnitude of accelerated military technology. And so the wounds that come with that will be so far greater than anyone's ever had to deal with. And that's why we come to World War I. You're talking about the amount of casualties, military casualties, is 9 to 10 million. The civilian casualties are estimated 16 to 20 million. And so this is not just, this is societies at war. This was the collapse of societies, potentially. And the world had never seen anything like this. And this is why, going over years, you talk about, was there an accelerated technology? Yes, there was, but there almost needed to be, otherwise the society would no longer exist. But what they talked about is the weaponry had a phenomenal amount of impact on mortality, just became more deadly. But you're also seeing an interesting acceleration in the medical field at this time as well. When you're looking at World War I, X-rays started to become much more prominent. In 1914, Marie Curie had her little, what they called petite curies, which was portable X-ray machines. So you could actually, on the field, X-ray someone who had been injured, see what happened. You could even see at that point in time bullets or shrapnel that had gone in. So this is an amazing advancement. The antisepsis came on in, and this was by a French surgeon, Alex Carrel, and an English chemist, Henry Drysdale, and they developed an antisepsis, chlorine-based antiseptic. And so the bacteria was only starting to be known a few decades beforehand, and so they started to clean wounds. And that would make a huge impact. You will then also have vaccination. So there was a period of, I think it was the French who had typhoid run through the army, and over 100,000 people soldiers were affected, and they had over a 20% mortality rate. And that's from a disease, nothing to do with the conflict. And so mandatory vaccination came in for the armies as well. Canadian troops also had tetanus injections. And so you're seeing this advancement. One of the other really significant ones is blood transfusions. Now, we were experimenting with blood transfusions up to this point, and you even see men being transfused with lamb blood, but it had to be direct because we didn't know how to preserve blood. Well, in 1914, a Belgian doctor, Albert Houston, added citrate to the blood, which stopped it coagulating. And so blood was able to be stored for transfusion later. Never happened. And so they actually found that it could last 7 days. And when you think about that,
It's uncomfortable. We have to begrudgingly acknowledge the other side of the coin of war and conflict being these benefits to health and medicine.
And that's the real sort of conflict of it. And that's something I'll ask the guest. How do you balance sort of the beneficial saving lives as well as being a soldier and pretty much out there to take lives? It's just an interesting dichotomy. But chances are blood transfusions would have been decades later because you didn't need that much blood. And this anticoagulant forced it being used on the battlefield. We also have the advancement clearly of prosthetic limbs and rehabilitation. And then we get to World War II. And this is where we have the antibiotics forefront. So around this time, we're starting to understand the impact that antibiotics have, vaccinations, even anti-malaria, and because malaria is such a huge impact on soldiers. And so there was even the advancement, the German military, and it wasn't until the Allies x-rayed some of German prisoners of war that they found metal in their body, metal pretty much against the limbs. And this was when metal plates were being used to assist with not just wound fracture, but bone setting. So we have now understanding that a metal rod can help stabilize bones and help heal quicker. And so an Allies realised that could be done. And that's even when we get to the Vietnam War, we have the impact of people being injured, but we start to see massive transfusion protocols come in. So there was the average man has about 8 to 10 pints of blood. Soldiers were coming in requiring transfusions and receiving up to 10 to 20 pints.
Is that because it was exiting at the same time?
That's right. So this is part of the massive transfusion protocol, and they were still surviving. So we realised you could pretty much change a patient's all blood, and they will still survive. And so today we have massive transfusion protocols about how, if someone has a really significant injury, we can give them a lot of blood, save their life, and they'll still recover. But again, this is part of our understanding of medicine and war.
I'm going to have to rewatch some of the MASH TV series episodes now with a new prism through which to view it. Not just the comedy and the horror, but also looking at the medical advances that are applied in the field. Dr. Dan Pronk is a qualified general practitioner who completed his studies and training on an Army scholarship. Upon completion, Dan completed SAS selection with the Australian Army and moved into special operations, where he served for 5 years, including 4 tours of Afghanistan. He was awarded a Commendation for Distinguished Service for his conduct in combat during his second tour. After discharge from the Army, Dan completed a Master of Business Administration, was a Deputy Director of a regional hospital and a Medical Director for a state prison health service. He's also authored several books, including Do we bleep this one? Average 70 kilogram khead, the combat doctor, and the resilience shield. Dan's married to a very tolerant wife, has 3 wonderful children, and his hobbies include driving his restored vintage Lamborghini and waiting for tow trucks. Dr. Dan Pronk, welcome to This Medical Life.
Steve, Trav, thank you kindly for having me.
Now, can you start off by telling us about your journey to how you found yourself working in special forces as a doctor in Afghanistan?
Yeah, look, it was a pretty roundabout way of getting there, to be honest. I didn't start off life with any intent of being a doctor or being in the army. I did grow up in an army family. My dad was an army helicopter pilot. And I've got an older brother, Ben, who from the earliest age was always seemed destined to get into the army. School cadets, loved the army, and indeed got a Defence Force scholarship to go to the Defence Force Academy straight out of school. And so he was on that trajectory from the earliest of time. But for me, I went in a different direction. I had long hair, dreadlocks, earrings, and I found sport and particularly triathlon in my mid-teens, and so pursued that out of school. And so for 5 years there, I chased the professional triathlon circuit around on the Gold Coast, and I did a exercise science degree during that time. So I did it part-time over a number of years on the Gold Coast, and enjoyed that, did well at that, but the dream was always professional sport. In my early 20s, about 23, I reckon it became clear I wasn't going to be the athlete that I wanted to be. I just, plain and simple, wasn't good enough, and started to look at what I was actually going to do as a career. And by that time, I'd finished exercise science, had done well in it, well enough to look towards sitting GAMSAT and getting into medical school. And I did just that, got into med school, realised I needed to fund that somehow. And all of a sudden the army started to become appealing. So they had a scholarship scheme to put people through med school. Applied for one of those, got one of those, and that came together to study medicine on an army scholarship. And so started med school 2001 in Adelaide at Flinders. And by that time, my brother had done his officer training, some time as an infantry officer, and he'd done SAS selection and gone to the Special Air Service Regiment. And so I got a bit of a look at what that world looked like and decided that was for me. I desperately wanted to try and get into special operations. And so long story short, finished med school, a couple of years as a junior doctor, 1 year as a junior doctor in the army, and then got the chance to do SAS selection. Went and did that, was successful there, and then that led into special operations. So that was how it all came about.
Dan, I know Travis is dying to get into the combat doctor book, but I've got to ask.
Yeah.
You were down the athletic path, the sports path. You know what? This is not for me. I'm not quite cut out for this. But then you pass special services selection. Isn't that like a million leagues beyond sport?
Look, it's a very physical challenge. I think people overemphasize the physical aspect. It's really special forces selection, be it military or police tactical groups, it's a mental beast. It's a test of mental resilience. But certainly, and it wasn't that I wasn't cut out in my mind for professional sport. I just wasn't good enough. I was making up numbers in the professional field. I was training with the best in the world, and they were just head and shoulders better than me. So, I was keen, and it wasn't that I wanted to walk away. It was just this realization that I wasn't ever going to be at that elite echelon. And that was what I'd aspired to do. It was clear I wasn't going to achieve that goal. And so I decided to change tack. So yeah, but in many ways, the pursuing SAS selection was kind of a proxy in my mind for what I perceived as a failure in my triathlon aspirations. It was this lofty goal that I needed to train towards and would be for me, a great accomplishment to complete. And so it sort of ticked a box that I never ticked in triathlon in a lot of ways.
Got it.
Now, I can talk about SAS selection all day, but I'll focus on the Combat Doctor, which is a book that you've written. I found it fascinating. It's certainly in my wheelhouse of enjoyment. When you wrote it, there was actually a number of chapters that sort of struck me. There was a number of chapters dedicated to soldiers who had died during a mission that you were involved with. And I was listening, wondering, was writing this book a form of catharsis, or was this, because it's such a traumatic, experience, was that part of you coming to understand what it was like to be a doctor in the field and processing that emotion.
Absolutely. You're spot on there, Trav. And indeed, those chapters of the book, so the book's only just come out this year, but I wrote those chapters in 2011. So they were a cathartic exercise, and it was done on the recommendation of an Army psychologist when I got home from that particular tour, my second tour of Afghanistan, where I responded to three of my teammates and couldn't save any of those three. And I was a bit scrambled. And when I got back, in the post-operative psych debrief, the psych said, "Hey, have you thought about writing these events down as a way of just organizing the thoughts in your mind, filling in some blanks that you don't necessarily remember correctly when you're thinking about these high intensity traumatic memories? You tend to just pinpoint fixate these little snippets." And so it was exactly that, a cathartic exercise. And I wrote down in great detail those three particular events, and then started to fill in some blanks around them. And then that started what turned out to be 130,000 words. I realized that I found writing very cathartic, but also I loved it. So the Combat Doctor, I started writing that over a decade ago, and it just, in that format, it wasn't right for publication, as you'd understand. That was just designed for catharsis. But then finally got around, and the time was right to edit it to a publishable point.
Right. Now, we're coming into this episode, we were looking at sort of the history of medicine and war, and seeing that actually the development has been quite advanced. But one question I wanted to ask you is how you balance being a doctor in a field trying to save lives, as well as being a soldier in the field who's trying to pretty much
end life.
Yeah, that's right. How is that balance sort of in your mind?
Yeah, it seems like a strange paradox, and I understand that. It was very natural for me at the time. To be truthful, I never questioned that paradox of being a healer with an organization that's main mission profile was kill capture. And so it sort of, I guess I saw that forum as the ultimate environment within which to test my medical skills. Basically, it was hugely professionally rewarding. It was very stimulating, and to have a skill set that could potentially make the difference between life and death with people that I knew and were part of my tribe, that for me was the ultimate privilege to be a part of that. And I mean, indeed, we used our medical skills on the enemy, on local nationals. So the Geneva Convention dictates that if an enemy is wounded, we treat them. And then that was what we found ourselves doing on occasion. So I guess I just saw that for me, and just coming in at an individual level, that was the ultimate, as I said before, test of the skill set in a complex environment. And so it was easy for me to reconcile it. It didn't, and the military component of it, and the times where I wasn't there primarily as an offensive capability, but I needed to be trained and able to conduct myself in that environment to be able to project forward, to be there to help people when they needed it. So it sort of one came with the other.
Mm. Now, in the book, you mentioned that General Practitioner was actually the recommended specialty by the Army. Can you tell us why that was?
Well, fundamentally, I mean, I'm guilty of probably overemphasizing the role of treating battlefield wounds and being there at point of injury and all that kind of business. But the mainstay of your role as a doctor in the military is a GP role. It's maintaining the health of the military members. So if you're with the Defence Force, your primary point of contact, if you're unwell, is a military doctor. It's not a civilian doctor. So you're fundamentally a GP. And just it was probably a little unusual to be in the situation that myself and some of the other doctors with special operations found ourselves in, where we projected forward. That would normally be the role of a combat medic or a patrol first aider or a combat first aider. And it just, the stars kind of aligned, if you like, for a small group of us to be able to get that pre-hospital experience. But GP is what is the mainstay of the role. And coupled to that, because you're full-time army and you're expected to, or full-time military, you're expected to turn up to work at a military base, 5 days a week. There's not too many training programs, specialty training programs in medicine that are flexible enough for you to be doing your army time and then doing the other part-time. So, I mean, it's a combination of those two things. It's what the army needed, and it was the program that was flexible enough for me to do mostly army time, and some of that counted to GP training, and then maybe get a day off a week here and there to go and do some GP stuff. So it was pretty much the only program that you could do around a full-time army commitment.
What additional training did you do as a GP that you found really useful in your role in the army?
There's a lot. So there's a very deliberate series of training courses when you first come into uniform. So you do, on the scholarship scheme I was on, and I assume it's still the same, I've not kept track, but you do your medical schooling like any other civilian doctor would. You get into med school like anyone else. You do med school like anyone else. You are full-time military. They pay you, but you don't do anything military. You're just a med student. After that, you do 2 years in civilian hospitals to get some medical experience, your internship like any other doc, and a residency year. And then you go into uniform. So the first year or so in uniform is doing military courses. Some of them are pure military training. Others are learning to use your medical skill set in a military context. So you do a medical evacuation, a helicopter medical evacuation course. You do a thing called a medical officer introductory course. You do some logistics stuff. You do a basic officer training package. You do early management of severe trauma, EMST. So you get this initial skill set, then you consider deployable. And then once I entered into the special operations, they've got quite a robust training pipeline to then upskill you further in the sort of ballistic trauma type stuff, what's called tactical combat casualty care, TCCC. So learning to then apply that skill set in the complex environment of the battlefield.
Dan, at the beginning of this episode, Travis took us right through the history of all the sorts of injuries humans have sustained in war over the years. In your case, what were the types of injuries that you had to deal with in the field?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And that's a great sort of synopsis of how it's moved along, and those advancements in weapon systems, but those equal advancements in protective equipment have led to this really interesting series of wounding profiles that we see. So the big ones that we would see were blast and high velocity gunshot wounds. Right. They were the kind of mainstay of what we were seeing pretty much day in, day out in Afghanistan. And so, but with the things like your ballistic plates, so your Kevlar vests, your ballistic helmets, ballistic glasses. So there was a lot of protective equipment that minimized the injuries to vital organs. So you would often see high velocity gunshot wounds to limbs, high velocity gunshot wounds to things like shoulders and pelvises, those junctional areas, abdomens, but not so much the chest. We did see that. And then blast with its full spectrum of wounding profiles, from that kind of massive overpressure from a high explosive blast that ruptures eardrums, damages lungs, that blast wave, and then the shrapnel effect, the effect of being picked up by the blast wave and thrown. So this mixture of penetrating and blunt force trauma with that high energy blast wave superimposed on top of it. So they were the mainstay, blast and gunshot wound.
I need to know, though, when you watch the movies or read the hero novels where they get shot in the arm and they just quickly that doesn't seem to bear the reality that you're talking about. Or can it?
It absolutely can. This is the fascinating part, in that there's these textbook wounding profiles of things like a high velocity gunshot, which are pretty horrendous, and there's a lot of energy that gets dissipated into tissue with high velocity. But there was no shortage of case studies that I was involved in where people would get shot, bullet goes straight through, and if it hasn't hit anything vital, then they do quite fine, or vice versa. something relatively low velocity or a very small injury being absolutely catastrophic. So it was really luck of the draw as so many factors are involved with particularly penetrating gunshot wound, missile wounds, penetrating injury. So I saw plenty of people shot just straight through and through, and they just kept on going, kept on soldiering. So yeah, I mean, it can happen. So it's not beyond the realms. Although, yeah, Hollywood does tend to ham it up a bit sometimes.
Well, it's just one of the things about battle is some people talk about it as a thrill or even just almost an addictive drug. The fear, adrenaline mix and everything. Is that something that you found or you struggled with when you had to leave?
Yeah, all of the above. I absolutely loved it. I did. It was, and I think the part of it was the summation of so many years of effort towards this very deliberate goal. So it was the realization of what ended up being me thinking I wanted to join the SAS at the end of 2001 was when that thought was seeded in my mind. I was in Perth, where the SAS regiment is based. My brother was about to go to Afghanistan. It was shortly after the Twin Towers had fallen, September 11, and that was when I first met a few SAS blokes, and they're the ones that said to me, "Hey, you should think about doing selection. Come to the unit." And it was a light bulb moment. So that was 01, and then I couldn't get on the selection course until 2008. So I had this 7-year period to think about it, to train for it, to kind of dream about it. And so by the time I did selection, got through, did my training with special operations, then deployed to Afghanistan to use this skill set in that combat environment, it was, I guess, probably a good analogy is like an athlete, say a footy player that dreams about being a professional athlete and trains, finally gets to that level and then runs out on the footy field for the first time to play their first game of professional sport. It's akin to that. And so it was something that was really a professional goal of mine for a long time. And then I found that environment so stimulating and of course, a massive adrenaline rush. And I found it a lot of the time to be a real flow state. Like I'd be, when I was in combat environments or particularly treating combat casualties, you'd click into this really serene, peaceful kind of focused state. And it was quite intoxicating, to be honest. I loved it.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another part of this that you go into in your book, and you're very honest about the negative long-term mental effects that this had, probably manifested after you actually left the army. What was the best way that you managed this?
That's a great question. And yeah, it was, with hindsight, it was a very stressful environment. I think there's so many professions, and I've come to reflect on this a lot. Your police, AMBOs, emergency department staff, I think doctors in general, nurses in general, mental health, healthcare professionals, these sort of groups exist in these high stress environments. And I think you recalibrate and normalize these abnormal exposures. And when I reflect back, I realized that was exactly what I was doing. I was in this pressure cooker environment, not just me, we all were, but it seemed normal for the longest time. But your body's firing this chronic stress response that I think it keeps you functional and even thriving. And so for me, it wasn't until I got out of the army that a lot of this stuff kind of caught up with me. And I thought, oh, hang on a sec, this wasn't normal. And I think also there was a constant distraction in special operations. There was always something to go back to. These missions where we would lose guys, you'd be out targeting a day or two later again. So you were constantly distracted. You didn't have time to sit and think and process. It was very easy to pack these things away and just keep moving forward. And when I got out, I think my pace of life slowed down and these things started to catch up with me, if you like. I was outrunning them, if you like, for 5 years, and then they finally caught up with me. And I think also probably the bigger part was there was a lot of protective factors involved being part of a dynamic team like the special operations. There was the sense of tribe, these people that you experienced this stuff with that understood you, that could empathize with what you were going through. And there was a sense of purpose, sense of identity. All of this sort of stuff was really causing resilience in that environment. And then when I got out and had that big life change of transition, I lost a bunch of that resilience that kind of left me vulnerable to some of these stressors.
I want to explore the resilience factor in just a moment, but just finally, for this first segment that you're with us, a former soldier, a civilian working as a doctor. Are there any benefits from your former life in the Army, SAS, that have brought you to your practice today?
Oh, for sure. Look, there's plenty. I think for one, the training and those skills and everything that came with it, I found very useful in particularly working in emergency departments, and approaching trauma in EDs is something that you don't get a lot of exposure to as a general practitioner in Australia, which is a good thing, But so it certainly made me very confident in that environment. Certain skills like things like intraosseous, things like surgical airways, all this stuff that would normally, chest tubes would normally make a GP panic, would make me panic before I'd had these experiences, are now a little bit demystified and not as concerning. But the bigger thing for me is this complete change in my perspective on life across the board, this recalibration, this appreciation of everything that I have in my life that's always been there, but I've never seen it before. And that simply come from having these experiences, going to developing countries, going to war zones, being able to see the impact on and how people live in most of the world. And then you come back to Australia and then having these experiences where, mates of mine who were sons, were husbands, were fathers, didn't come home. And, I'm all of those things. It makes you a better version of yourself if you can have that perspective and be far more grateful. And I've certainly found myself all of those things.
Just one light aside, because I imagine any GP waiting room, you always have a little queue that builds up over time, depending on the day. In your case, with patients knowing you are trained in weapons, do you get very few complaints in that scenario?
I don't think I've ever been spotted as this guy in that context, to be honest. And that whole tough guy thing, I mean, it was easy to be tough when I was surrounded by SAS soldiers and had Apache gunships overhead and this sort of stuff. That's easy to be tough there. When you take off the body armor and the M4, I'm just a sort of skinny middle-aged man. So no, I don't think I'm intimidating in any way, shape or form.
All right, well, let's take a couple of seconds R&R. I'll be back and we'll talk about resilience. Dr. Dan Pronk is still with us because we need to get into yet another area of discussion that links to the broad topic we're talking about, but this time coming in via the theme of resilience. Dan, perhaps could you start telling us about Resilience Shield and why you wrote the book with your brother, Ben Pronk, and Tim Curtis, both former members of the SASR?
Yes, so Resilience Shield started basically when I got out of the military and some of these stressful events, these traumatic exposures started to catch up with me within the first 6 to 12 months of getting out of the military. And it was a reflection on this, what seemed paradoxical, that I'd never been safer. I was home with my family more than ever. I was earning twice my military wage as a civilian doctor. And yet this was the time when I started to have these, significant flashbacks and bad dreams, this hypervigilance, anxiety, anger was on a hair trigger, everything that I recognized as a doctor as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. But it was occurring at a time in my life where I had so much less stress in my life, and so it got me looking at what was so protective about the military environment, and particularly that special operations environment. What were these factors that were bolstering all of our resilience and allowing us to continue to function at the level we needed to for years and years and years in these super high stress environments? And if I could work out what those factors were, maybe I could rebuild them and get back to a good place myself. So it was sort of this what have I lost? What is this metaphoric armor that I've taken off last time I took off my literal armor, and how do I rebuild it? And so that was the catalyst to take a deep dive into the scientific literature and have a look at what is resilience, try and define it. What do we know causes resilience? What is stress, and how does it affect us? Why is it affecting me now? And that all started to come together, started to join forces with my brother and Tim, and we started to have a deep dive into resilience and started to think that maybe we had something to offer here with regards to a model of resilience that might be add to the narrative.
There was a mention in the book that there was a statistic, actually. There was, of 100 Australians by the age of 65, there would be 27 who had died. There was 68 who would be broke. There was 50% who would suffer a relationship breakdown. 50% have poor mental health, and 82 would have a chronic illness. Now, that struck me as quite an amazing statistic. Now, with the Resilience Shield, it was sort of looking at, it's part philosophy, part self-help. Like, how would you best describe, I guess, the book, really?
What it's designed to do is provide a more holistic review of resilience. I think resilience is a word that has been done to death, and I think we all inherently know what it means to us, but when you try and define it, it's very difficult. You say to someone, well, define, in 10 words or less, what's resilience? And they and and give you different bits and pieces. And then to take it that step further and say, well, how do you build it? And people are completely bamboozled. And so the project was designed to demystify resilience, to look at it from a more holistic perspective. We know that it's multifactorial. It's not just one or two things. It's not just the harden up or the stoic sort of get on with it. It's not just physical lift weights type thing and you'll be resilient. There's a whole bunch of stuff that makes you resilient. It's multifactorial. So the project was designed to have a look at it from all its angles, decompose it or deconstruct it down into these layers of the Resilience Shield model, and then look on a granular level how you can proactively, deliberately, and habitually build resilience on a day-to-day basis across all of those layers. The other thing, and just as a quick aside, for us, when we looked at this, it wasn't enough for us to say, hey, we used to be in the army, we did this, do this, or the studies say this. We got a federal government research grant. We're partnered with University of Western Australia, and we've been able to gather a bunch of data through a survey, which sits on our website. And we've got about 20,000 data sets now. And so we've been able to scientifically validate our model of resilience. That was another thing. We can quantify resilience, so we can put a number to it. That was important to us, because if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, is a great quote by Peter Drucker, a management guru. We've got this survey, we've got the data sets, and we've just published a couple of months back in a peer-reviewed psychological journal the empirical proof of the model. So we wanted some science behind it, and we've been able to achieve that. That was basically that's the gist.
You mentioned the layers of the resilience model. I just want to hone in because you mentioned Stoicism a couple of times, and my colleague David Olney in my day job has introduced me to Stoicism, and through some other work I'm doing, and there's a Waking Up app by Sam Harris, there's an interview in which he talks about Professor William B. Irvine, who is very well studied in the literature around Stoicism. And one of the things that disarmed me was this thing he got from them called the last time meditation. Because with every person in your life, with every aspect of your life, there's always the last time that you're going to have that interaction, but you don't know which one it will be. And so by approaching everything as if it's the last time, it sort of shrinks your focus to have focus and appreciate what you've got. Is that a foundational layer to this? Is this a little bit higher? How does this fit in with your model?
Yeah, look, I mean, we love the Stoic philosophies. And I mean, that talks to that whole memento mori type, remember you will die philosophy. And Marcus Aurelius was very renowned as being very aware of the finality. And like you say, you never know when that last time is going to be. And that draws into, I mean, to come back to Trav, those statistics you quoted from the book, all these horrendous things. And we know that we all know inherently we're going to die at some point, and yet we live our life as if we've got all the time in the world. And so trying to bring that into focus, and our experiences in the military really have helped us bring that into acute focus, because we've seen the tragic loss of people, lives cut short. And so, the Resilience Shield model is very much underpinned by Stoic philosophies. The get active in your own rescue, the memento moris, these sort of things are fundamental to the model. and just the mindfulness, the being in the moment, the being present, and letting go of that distraction. And the mindfulness piece and the meditative piece is really fundamental to resilience and allows that being present, which is the living in the moment and making sure you are capitalizing on every experience with that stoic underpinning of you never know which one of those is going to be your last.
I was just going to say, looking at the Resilience Shield and the book, and clearly the questionnaire online, who is the target audience for the Resilience Shield?
It's a great question, and we initially approached it from a very military mindset because that was our background, the three of us. And then as we went along, it started to become apparent that we were looking at stress and resilience, and it became apparent that it doesn't matter what your stress is, the body behaves in a pretty predictable pattern in terms of the mental, the psychological responses to stresses, acute and chronic, and then your physiological responses. So stress is stress. It doesn't matter if your stress is the stress of being on combat operations as a soldier, the stress of being a busy parent, or the stress of being an accountant, or where, insert stress here. We're all under stress. Our bodies and minds react that same way. And then resilience, these fundamentals of building resilience are across the board as well. So once again, it doesn't matter who you are. Those different layers, that innate, the mind layer, body layer, social layer, professional layer, and that adaptation, they are universal. And so it became apparent that this was far more widely applicable than we'd initially thought. We'd looked at it from a military/first responder perspective, which it's highly relevant and has, it's been quite well accepted by those communities because I think it fits those cultures. People can look at this and it's not too far in the touchy-feely, airy-fairy type realm to be inaccessible or unacceptable to first responder communities. But to come back to your question, Trav, I mean, this is, it's not a product for everyone. It's a product for people who are interested in building their own resilience, basically. So people who are interested in getting active in their own rescue. That's a snippet of a Marcus Aurelius quote that I'm flogging there. But so proactive people who recognize they're under stress and want to build their own resilience deliberately and ahead of the stress catching up with them.
Given our key listeners are GPs and people in the medical field, so this is not exactly first responder, but it's right up there at the pointy end of life, where there would be constant stress. Perhaps we could just tackle this. There's a bit of the philosophy where you talk about always a little bit further, setting up and achieving some micro goals. Could you just reflect openly on that with perhaps GPs in mind or people in hospital environments, etc., about finding a foothold to start applying some of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I've done quite a number of sessions with GPs. It's been great. I've been working with the College of General Practitioners and done some CPD certified RACGP stuff.
Right.
So they've latched onto this. And there's actually an ex-SAS guy who's now working with the College of General Practice, and we've worked together to develop the program. But when you look at coming back to that stress is stress, when you look at the statistics on mental health, particularly among the medical profession, it's pretty damning. And then when you start to go down into the subcategories of who's being most affected, general practitioners are right at the pointy end of the statistics on poor mental and physical health. And so it is a overrepresented professional sort of role that is a high stress role. And I think COVID has tightened the screws on that considerably. So from a GP perspective, we found that this has been a useful tool to engage. And the other thing, interestingly, and this is reflected in the literature as well, GPs know all this stuff. We're not, they know this stuff, and they're there in consults telling it to their patients. You need to be doing this, and you should be doing this, and you should be getting a bit of exercise, and you should be eating a bit better, and look after your sleep, and, are you catching up with your mates, and all this good stuff. But as a group, we're not doing it ourselves. And so it's it's a good reminder. And the always a little further piece is just talks to the fact that this isn't about heroic interventions. This isn't about, okay, fad diets, crash diets, I'm going to fast for 3 weeks or go on a 10-day silence retreat or run a marathon in 6 weeks. And once again, we wouldn't encourage our patients to do that. And so we need to turn that lens back on ourselves and just do small, regular, sustainable, habitual positive interventions across the layers of this Resilience Shield model to slowly, always a little further, build and maintain a robust resilience.
I'm more getting the sense that a pigeon pair book to read with yours would be Atomic Habits by James Clear, which is very much based in a similar model.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so much good stuff out there. And we reference a lot in the book. I think in Resilience Shield, we've got about 270 references that just acknowledges that there is so much out there, and we encourage people to read widely around it. I mean, it's not, our book isn't designed to be the Bible of resilience. It's just hopefully getting people thinking about this, looking at resilience in a more holistic way and a deconstructed way, so you can start to approach it, and build this resilience across these layers, but then also read widely. And yeah, Atomic Habits, fantastic book that talks to this. How do you make something habitual? And there's a lot of great science behind that. And that's at the crux of all of this. How do you build these habits so that they're sustainable to be able to build and maintain your resilience?
Now, I'm just wanting to take a step back just before we finish up, because I going through all your books, again, I've always loved Army and reading everything, but I wanted to ask a question for GPs who haven't had that experience, doesn't have the military background, but may have a patient who either had a military background or isn't. Is there anything that is important for that GP to ask someone who has been in the military or has been past? Is there something that's useful for them to prompt them with?
Oh, look, for sure. I think just that acknowledgement. I think that, and this isn't unique to military members who have discharged. I mean, this is your police, your AMBOs, your fireys, these other organisations that have been in that sort of an environment, that high stress environment, particularly if military members have deployed and maybe been on operations. They might have had some pretty unique exposures to critical incidents, to stressors, and I think a big part of the military members trying to reintegrate into the civilian world when you discharge is that feeling of being misunderstood and of being kind of quite lonely, that you're kind of separate to the civilian population, and I think there's a responsibility on both sides of that equation of the military member to adapt and adjust and reintegrate. But it's nice on a societal level when people just take an interest and have a understanding of the fact that this person might have had some unique exposures that might be staying with them and might be hard to articulate to people who haven't had similar exposures. And so I think that just an acknowledgement of military service, a gentle kind of questioning around, is there anything that's staying with you? That how are you going with your transition? I think a massive part of it is normalizing the fact that what they might have been exposed to or they might have experienced, normalizing the fact that it's abnormal, kind of saying, hey, wow, that's a big deal. I'm not surprised that you're struggling with that. Or even if they haven't had those critical exposures, that simple transition from military identity to civilian identity is a big transition, and it really unsettles a lot of people. And I think, once again, normalizing that, saying, hey, well, you've been in the Army or the Air Force or the Navy for 15 years. It's going to take you some time to readjust to being a civilian. And so, being kind to yourself, looking after yourself. How much are you drinking? That's probably a decent question to ask, and then double the answer that they give you is probably a reasonable. It's like when you ask your doctor how much they drink. But I think just that understanding that you can't relate necessarily, but that doesn't matter. The normalization of what might have been abnormal, and then just creating that expectation that it's probably going to be a bit of a struggle to reassimilate, and that's normal. They're not abnormal. This is just a transition.
I think there was a golden insight amid all of that too, which occurred to me last week. One of my daughter's school friends, her dad's a police officer, and she was talking to me, and I was driving them off somewhere, and she said, "Oh, yeah, Dad hates driving on the roads." He said, "Oh, I hate driving among civilians."
Yeah.
And that them, like, to acknowledge they are seen apart. That is the model in which they operate. But advice, someone listening, considering a medical career in the military, your thoughts?
Look, for the right person, it's magic. It really is brilliant. But my advice is always to go in with your eyes open and try and gather as much information as you can. Think about what a career might look like outside of the military. So the advice I give a lot of people talking about medicine or talking about special operations is map out the next 10 to 15 years of your life. Draw a timeline and look at what that might look like if you do pursue medicine in the army, for instance, or in the military, for instance, versus as a civilian, and really think it through, because it's a great role, but it comes with, there's a significant downside. If you've got, say, for instance, a young family, as I did when I was in the army and with special operations, you're away a lot. It's a hell of a tough life. And I'm very lucky that my wife is such a stoic woman, because she was pretty much a single mum for that 5-year period. We had 2 young kids at that point. And so, I mean, there is this downside. It's not all, hanging out of helicopters and gunfighting and whatever else. It's you're from a medical perspective, it's quite limiting. So you're dealing with a population of healthy young in the army, mostly blokes. And so it's very limiting. You're not seeing kids, you're not seeing old people, you're not seeing chronic disease. You're seeing a very limited subset. And it took me a number of years to reskill when I got out of the army. Look at the finances. What are you going to earn in the army versus being a doctor outside? So I'm certainly not trying to dissuade people, but you need to go into it wanting to get the military experience, probably as much as, if not more so than the medical experience, would probably be the summation of it.
Eyes wide open.
Eyes wide open, yeah.
Look, Dan, thank you so much for this. Just on the off chance, there is one listener, a GP, a specialist, someone in the medical fraternity, who's still thinking, I don't think this is quite relevant to me. Is there one high gain question they could ask themselves, or one activity they could do as a litmus test to see how they're faring on this aspect of stress and being in more harmony with their internal world and their external world?
That's the idea of the resilience survey. So I'd encourage those people to hop on our website, resilientshield.com, do the survey. It'll take you about 15 minutes, and you'll end up with so it's 42 questions that are aligned with the layers of the Resilience Shield model. And it's be aware that your score sits on a bell curve. So sitting around the 50th centile is right plumb in the middle of the average of our 20-odd thousand data sets. So don't be disheartened if you score a 48 when you're used to, as a doctor, probably scoring 98s on everything. What that does, and we found this quite confronting. I found it quite confronting when I did it, to be honest. And I co-wrote the book. I like to think I know about this stuff. But it gives you that overall score, but it gives you your layer scores across the mind layer, the body layer, the social layer, and the professional layer. And just have a look at that and really reflect on that. Are you in balance, or are you, like a lot of us, particularly doctors, are you heavily stacked in the professional layer at the cost of your social mind and body layer? And so I think that would be what I would encourage people to do. Spend 15 minutes, do the survey, and then reflect on the results. And if you're well balanced and you're well rounded and you're doing it great, then don't waste your $35 on our book. But it might just be a bit of an eye opener, and lots of people have found that quite confronting, actually. And be honest with the survey answers. Don't answer the questions how you think will give you the best result. Be truthfully, brutally honest with yourself, knowing that only you get that result. We get some de-identified aggregate data. But so that's what I would advise them. Spend 15 minutes doing that, have a good hard look at that, and then ask yourself the question again: am I resilient? Am I in balance? And if no, maybe our book's for you.
So full honesty, unlike the quite guarded way I talk to my GP and report on things. Dr. Dan Pronk, thank you so much for joining This Medical Life.
Steve, Trav, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a Pathnotes Proprietary Limited production.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.